Welcome to my running solo and GM-less games video. My name is Roosevelt Cooper from Golden Acacia Gaming. In this video, I'm going to be demonstrating to you how to resolve the knowledge that you possess as a player from the knowledge that your character possesses when you're running a solo or a GM-less game. In a typical tabletop role-playing game, you typically have a game master who has all the knowledge about the adventure, about the encounter, and about the campaign that you are embarking on. And then you have one or more player characters who play the role of a specific character who is a part of that adventure, who is a part of that campaign. And with that setup, it's not as difficult to try to navigate the challenge between what you know as a player and what your character knows as a character. Now, granted, there are some challenges with that, even in that type of environment. You may have heard of the concept called metagaming, which may be frowned upon depending upon who your game master is and what their philosophy is on metagaming. But the concept of metagaming simply means when you take information that you know as a player and utilize it to benefit your character. However, when you're running a solo or GM-less game, because there is no GM, you're going to have access to significantly more information than what you would typically have access to if you were playing a tabletop role-playing game using a traditional format. Because of that, there needs to be a mechanism that you can use to resolve what is it that you know as a player versus what is it that your characters know as characters. Otherwise, it just becomes too easy for your characters to be able to navigate. They'll know where all the secret treasure is, they'll know where all the traps are, and it won't be as satisfying of an experience. Fortunately, there are a number of tools at our disposal that we can use as solo and GM-less players to be able to navigate that process and separate or differentiate the information that we know as players versus the information that our characters know as player characters. And I'll go over some of those tools in this video. If you're familiar with the Mythic Game Master Emulator 2nd edition, that manual has a number of different tools and resources that we can use as solo and GM-less players to be able to facilitate our play. And one of the foundational tools that Mythic offers is something called a fate chart. So one simple way that you can use to differentiate between something that your character knows and something that you know is by asking a fate question. For example, let's say you are running through a pre-published adventure and your character is navigating in a dungeon. And in this particular area of the dungeon, there is a trap. So now you know that there is a trap, but your character doesn't necessarily know that there is a trap. So how do you navigate that? Well, if you use a fate chart and a fate question, there's a very simple way that you can navigate that. You could just simply pose it as a fate question. So what you would do is you would ask the question, does my character search for traps? And then you would assign a likelihood that your character searches for traps based upon the personality traits and your character's unique knowledge, skills, and abilities in the game. You would assign a likelihood. So is it likely that your character searches for traps? Is it unlikely that your character searches for traps? Is it very likely that your character searches for traps? Whatever. You would assign one of those likelihoods, And then you would roll a die and see what comes up. If their answer is yes, then your character searches for traps using whatever mechanisms the tabletop role-playing system of choice that you're running allows for your character to be able to search for traps. If their answer is no, then your character does not search for traps, and then your character is going to trigger the trap. So that's one simple way that you can use. If you're using the Mythic Game Master Emulator, you can use that as a mechanism to be able to search for traps. If you're not using Mythic, very simple approach. Take a D10, assign a percentage chance that your character is going to search for traps. You roll it. If you get that percentage, then your character searches for traps. If you don't get that percentage, then your character does not search for traps. Very simple to be able to navigate that. Mythic also offers a system or methodology that you can use to run games without even using a pre-planned adventure, where the system itself will actually generate information for you. So if you're using a system like that, that's another way that you can resolve information that you know as a player versus information that your character knows, because the system is serving as the game master for you. And so the system is serving up the information that you need to know to navigate in the game. So for example, let's say your expected scene in Mythic is you expect to go into the dungeon and look for the monster who has been terrorizing the village. So if you're using Mythic, you're going to roll on that expected scene and see if that expected scene happens. If the expected scene happens, then the scene is going to play out just as you expect it. If the scene doesn't happen exactly the way you expect it, then you could get an altered scene where the scene will play out mostly the way you expect it, but there may be some alterations that you were not originally anticipating. Or you might get an interrupt scene where something else completely different happens before you even get to that point. And that new scene that gets generated is going to be a surprise for you that you may not necessarily have been anticipating from the very beginning. So that's another way that you can navigate this challenge, by having a system like Mythic serve as the game master for you, so that the system is what's generating the information as opposed to you specifically generating all of the information, or as opposed to you reading a pre-written adventure and that pre-written adventure giving you all of that information ahead of time. Another way that you can navigate information that your character knows versus information that you know is to use the mechanics in your particular tabletop role-playing system to be able to make those determinations. Case in point, I am currently running Tyranny of Dragons as a pre-published solo adventure, but I'm also using the Mythic Game Master Emulator to be able to add some surprises to the adventure to make it a little bit more unique experience. And in the first scene, we had a situation where the adventure characters entered the town that is under attack, and they encountered 7 kobolds who were surrounding a family in the town. So my expected scene was that the player characters were going to confront the kobolds and combat was most likely going to take place. However, when I tested that expected scene using the Mythic system said, no, that scene is not going to happen the way you expect it, and it's going to be changed. So when that happens using a pre-published adventure, what the Mythic system does is it has you to be able to generate a random event, and then the random event doesn't necessarily replace what the pre-published adventure has. It just simply adds to it. So based upon the random event that I rolled and generated, my interpretation of that random event was that the kobolds were going to ask the player characters for a payment in return for leaving the family alone. So see, that was cool because that wasn't something that was necessarily written in the pre-published adventure. That was a surprise that came up for me while playing the adventure, and then I got the opportunity to navigate around that. Then what I did was I used the mechanics of the role-playing game system that I was using, which in this case was the 2024 version of Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition. I used those mechanics to be able to navigate that process. So when the kobolds made the offer, my dwarven cleric, who had the highest amount of insight, he wanted to do an insight check to see if the kobolds were lying. So I did the check, and the check was successful. So the dwarf was able to determine if the kobolds were lying. So then once I knew that the dwarf would know if the kobold was lying, I then posed a fate question to Mythic. And the fate question is the kobold lying? And then I assigned a likelihood that the kobold was lying. I rolled, and it turned out that the kobold was lying. So now we was able to find out that the kobold was lying, which was my player knowledge, but my character, the dwarven cleric, also knew that the kobold was lying because my dwarven cleric passed the insight check. Therefore, the player characters were able to act accordingly by finding out that information that I, as a player, already knew. So you can use the mechanics of your tabletop role-playing game system to be able to allow the player characters to find out or learn information that you as a player already know. Another approach you can use is to have a concept where the information that you know as a player isn't always accurate and can be determined to be wrong at a later point in time in the adventure. So with this particular approach, you have information that you know as a player, but until it becomes time to be able to verify that information is just theory, for example. It's not necessarily guaranteed to be true until you get to the point in the adventure where it's time to find out if that information is true or not. This works really well when you're doing a role-playing game or an adventure that is investigative in nature, because in an investigation adventure, you as a player are going to learn facts that your player character may not necessarily know as of yet. But if you're going into the game with the mindset of these are facts that I've gathered, but we don't necessarily know the true interpretation of those facts until we find out, then that gives you flexibility to have your player knowledge not necessarily be an accurate representation of what's actually going on. So for example, let's say you're doing an investigation adventure and you as a player, by resolving the mechanics, you're able to find out that the doctor is actually the one that is committing the murders. So you might be tempted to just have your player character go, hey, well, you know what? I'm going to go to the doctor's office and I'm going to confront him because I now know that he is the one that is committing the murders. However, if you treat the information that you discovered as theory and not actual true reality until it gets fully tested and discovered in the game, that gives you the capacity for that information to be wrong and for you to still be able to be surprised when your character finally gets to the opportunity to discover whether that information is correct or not. So that is another approach you can take. You can take the information that you as the player character know and don't necessarily make it 100% facts until it is actually discovered and confirmed in the actual role-playing session itself. Another approach you could take is just say, hey, you know what? It's not a problem. I'm just going to go with it. That is another way that you can go about it. So if you find out information, you can now tailor your future expected scenes to go down the path of the information that you have discovered. So for instance, let's say you are playing a sci-fi adventure and you discover that the villain is located on this secret planet that no one else in the galaxy knows about. You can now tailor your expected scenes in the future to move the adventuring party towards the direction of discovering this secret planet. So that's another way that you can go about it. You can just simply accept the fact that, hey, you know what? I know this information and now I'm going to tailor my role-playing session towards the direction of the information that I now know that my player characters don't know. Another approach you can use, and this approach works really well when you're playing a pre-published adventure, is you can use a concept known as binding decisions. And I learned about this concept from the book DM Yourself. The book is written by Tom Scott. I'll post a link in the description to it if you're interested in buying it. But in DM Yourself, he has a concept called binding decisions. So the way that works is before you go into the adventure itself and start reading the adventure for the next scene, you make some binding decisions for your characters. So case in point, let's say your characters are about to go into a dungeon. You might make a binding decision that your characters are going to search for traps in every room. Or you might make a binding decision that your characters are not going to search for traps until they encounter and trigger the first trap. And then after that, they will begin searching for traps. Or you might make a decision that your character is not going to search for traps at all. So you make those binding decisions. And then after you make those binding decisions, then you will begin to read the scene in the pre-published adventure. And then you resolve the scene based upon what binding decisions you already made. So that is another strategy that you can use to differentiate between knowledge that you as a player know and knowledge that your player characters know. So those are some different strategies or approaches you can use to be able to deal with that. I have information that I know as a player that my characters don't know all the time. And I use many of these strategies to be able to resolve that information. So try it, see how it works for you in your game. And I believe it will help you to be able to walk that fine balance, so to speak, between navigating to information that you as a player know versus information that your player characters know.